A discovery like the Spence doesn't just happen. It's a consequence of a series of interconnected circumstances, events, and decisions that come together in a specific order. My talk will focus on the circumstances, events, and decisions that led to the Spence discovery. It won't be a detailed description of the exploration tools used or recipe for how to find another Spence. That would be pointless, as what worked for the Spence discovery only worked under specific circumstances, state of knowledge, and exploration of tools available 20 years ago. Nevertheless, there are some aspects and general concepts used to find Spence that remain timeless. Over 30 years ago, during a time when I was very busy, I started forgetting things, and I started using a system called the Franklin Planner, where I kept a written record of daily events, conversations, meetings with my bosses, reports, and other business associates. The information, dates, and decisions I mentioned in my talk come from these written records. Spence was a remarkable discovery. At the time of its first announcement, it was 350 million tons, grading 1% copper. It was a blind greenfields discovery in a porphyry belt that wasn't known to have deposits of that size. However, what was more remarkable really was who made it. It was made by a company with no exploration experience or presence in Chile until September 1992. It had a fraction of the budgets of its competitors. It had no expert geologists and no expert advisors telling it how to run its exploration. It had no proprietary database, and it made its discovery of the Spence deposit within 37 months of arriving in Chile. To understand what we were up to back then, you have to understand what was the exploration world like in the early 1980s, or 1990s, sorry. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. That was the end of the Soviet Empire. Communism had been discredited. Much of the world was opening up and accepting a free market economy. That led in Latin America and other jurisdictions to new investment laws, new mining codes, and a welcome of foreign investment. Back home in North America and Australia, the traditional exploration grounds, permitting was starting to become difficult. In 1967 in British Columbia, once you drilled out your deposit, you could permit and build it within 24 months, including getting the right to deposit your tailings in the ocean. In 1990, that development line had increased to about 40 months. The other thing is, after 30 years of being cooped up in their own jurisdictions, the major mining companies had the view that their home jurisdictions were mature, there was nothing left to find, and you needed to go someplace else. We'd also been through 10 years of declining metal prices in constant dollars. And back then, because permitting was so short, greenfields exploration was still a viable way to grow your business in the mining in the short and medium term. And this is just quickly go through, why does declining metal prices make greenfields exploration more attractive? The chart I have there is constant US dollars to copper price, timeline from 1980 to early 2000s. You can see there was a steady decline in the price of copper. So what does this do? What it means is that if you have a deposit that's sub-economic today or in 1990, next year it's going to be even more uneconomic because the real price of copper has declined. In this situation, it makes no sense to work on marginal deposits or uneconomic deposits. What you really need to do is find something better. My analogy really is at the bottom of the slide there. You can see some fishing boats that have been high and dry. In North America, Canada, the US, there were lots of deposits known that were low grade. They were like these fishing boats that have been marooned by the outgoing tide of lowering metal prices. So if you wanted to find a boat that you can go out and fish in, you had to walk to the ocean and find a new boat. All these factors created a stampede to Latin America. Those two pie charts show the distribution of exploration spending worldwide. between 1990 and 1995. As you can see, 1990, Latin America was getting about 12% of the exploration spend. Well, by 1995, that had more than doubled to 25%. Much of the money that went to Latin America came out of the United States, with lesser amounts coming out of Canada and Australia. So who was Rio Algom? At the time, Rio Algom was one of the larger Canadian mining companies. It had two aspects to its business. One was a metals distribution business, and the other was a mining division. By sales, most of the money was coming in through the distribution business, but by income, most of the profit was made by the mining division. Rio Algom was a company that was in trouble in the early 1990s. It was largely, most of its mining and income from mining came from the uranium mining business. These uranium mines were closing. Price of uranium had collapsed. All it was left with on the mining side was minority interests in a copper mine and a coal mine in British Columbia. The only hope for growth was really on a project called Cerro Colorado in northern Chile. This was a legacy project left over from the early 1980s when Rio Tinto allowed Rio Algom to acquire projects in Chile. Rio Tinto owned 51.4% of the company, used it as a cash cow. Profits, rather than being reinvested in Rio Algom, were paid out as dividends. By 1992, Rio Tinto decided to sell its interest for $400 million. The one thing it did do is it left Cerro Colorado within Rio Algom. Rio Tinto's attitude was Cerro Colorado was too small a project, didn't meet its corporate objectives. Although it left Cerro Colorado in Rio Algom, it did strip out any exploration, any data relating to any part of Chile outside the immediate mine area. The independent board of directors decided that growth for Rio Algom would come through the base metal mining part, and that growth would be based on building Cerro Colorado, and the growth strategy was largely acquisition driven, with a lesser amount of money spent on exploration. So how much money were they willing to spend on exploration? The reality was not very much, about $6 million a year. Chart on the left shows distribution of spend by Rio Algom's competitors. It's an old slide from about 1995. What you see on that slide is at the top are the usual suspects, big spenders. BHP was spending over $160 million a year in exploration. Rio Tinto wasn't far behind at around 120. Codelco here in Chile was in the middle of the pack, spending about $20 million a year. But remember, that $20 million was all being spent in Chile. Where you have to go is to lucky spot number 78 at the bottom. That's where Rio Algom's budget fit in. I'll give you an idea, at that time of the $6 million, about $2 million was being spent in Chile, which was about 1/10 of the budget that Codelco was spending here. So the guy that was in charge of deciding where the money was going to be spent for Rio Algom was Kelly O'Connor. He's the guy on the horse. He decided that he would focus his copper exploration in Chile because that's where the deposits that could make money at that time were known to exist, and that's also where the company wanted to grow its business. Kelly's philosophy was pretty simple. It was go where the deposits you need to find are located, acquire, test, and move on as quickly as possible. Spend as little money as possible on a project. In other words, minimize spend, don't turn it into a science project. And the other one is stay focused on what you need. Don't get distracted. He really did run exploration as if it was a business. In early September 1992, we opened an office here in Chile, in Iquique. We had a very, very clear mandate. We were to find a deposit that had at least 100 million tons, and it had to be at 1% grade or better. It had to be leachable, read supergene enriched. It had to be open pitable. meaning it had to be within 200 meters of surface, and it had to be near Cerro Colorado. The budget for it was about $1.6 million per year. The initial team consisted of me. I was sent down to head the organization here. My background had about 50% of my time up to this point had been looking for porphyry copper deposits in Western Canada. Alex Asencios was the only guy on the team that really had any prior experience in Chile or for looking for enriched copper deposits. Alex had been Utah's representative on David Lowell's successful team that found Escondida. Mike Thick was the other principal member of the team. He came from our office in Eastern Canada. He had very little porphyry experience. Most of his experience was in gold exploration, SEDEX, and VMS. What was the competitive environment in Chile was nearly every major mining company in the world was actively exploring here. There was very little publicly available information. There was no Google Earth. There was very little internet. There were rudimentary magnetic and gravity maps at a scale of 1 to 1,000,000 or greater. The main competitors of ours all had extensive databases because they'd been here before us for several years. We had no proprietary database, but what we did have was access to the Cerro Colorado mine, which at this time hadn't been developed. It was pristine. The other thing that was an advantage for us is that parts of the deposit were covered with gravel and ignimbrite. The state of knowledge in Chile at this time is shown on this map from a publication by Richard Silito. It was the first time I remember seeing a map that actually showed by age date the different belts, porphyry belts in Chile. The ones of importance to us, of course, were the two belts in northern Chile. Had the Eocene, which hosted all the known large copper deposits. And then we had its poorer cousin, Paleocene, that lay to the west. In the early 90s, the Paleocene was understood to only be able to host small deposits. Cerro Colorado was believed to be about as big as you could find in the Paleocene. That actually worked to our favor. That meant that most of the other companies were focused on exploration in the Eocene. Most companies turned their noses up at the Paleocene. So that meant it was available ground for us, fewer competitors, and we would have been quite happy to find another Cerro Colorado. The initial strategy from mid-92 to mid-1993 centered on exploring the Paleocene north and south of our Cerro Colorado deposit, pretty much from the latitude of Quebrada Blanca to about 50 kilometers north of the mine. Our assumption at the time was it was underexplored, that you could still find exposed supergene-enriched porphyries in the basement lithologies. Our exploration technique were the basic reconnaissance mapping, prospect, silt sampling, and rock geochemical sampling. At this time, early 93, Angus Campbell joined our team. The area, as you know, if you work here, is very difficult access. It's characterized by very deep quebradas where most of the basement lithologies are exposed, flatter plateaus of ignimbrite. In 92, there was even less access than there currently is. Just for reference, in the bottom, just under the writing there, is the Cerro Colorado deposit. Our competitors at the time used donkeys and very large crews of geologists and assistants to explore. We decided to use a helicopter. What that allowed us to do is, within a few months, we were able to cover our whole area, silt sample it all, do prospecting, land and look at showings. Our competitors, on the other hand, took over a year and an awful lot more money to carry out the same work. So what did we learn during that period? The first thing was that the basement was well exposed. The second thing we determined there was very little chance to find an exposed supergene deposit. And we also learned that helicopters can be a risky mode of transport. So we decided it was time to change the strategy. Mid-93 to mid-1994, our strategy was based on a belief that if there was a deposit left to be found, it would be under the ignimbrite cover. To narrow the search area and to vector in on specific places of the ignimbrite to explore, we used peripheral porphyry-type alteration, color anomalies that we had spotted during our earlier reconnaissance. This allowed us to select specific areas of ignimbrite to explore. But then the question became, how are we going to explore under the ignimbrites? This is where our advantage at Cerro Colorado came in as a testing ground. From 1992 when we arrived, and we continued to do this right through to the time I left in 97, we tried just about every technique we could to see whether any of these techniques would lead to the discovery of a Cerro Colorado-sized deposit. We did airborne magnetics, resistivities, radiometrics without much success. The results were indifferent. We did ground EM. The ground EM did pick up the blanket at Cerro Colorado, but when we ran it over a flat area south of the mine that we had condemned by drilling, we got another anomaly there. Eventually we concluded that the response from the EM was really coming from the groundwater, saline groundwater. We tried induced polarization. It worked. It did highlight the Cerro Colorado deposit, but we found it was extremely expensive. Poor ground contacts, the equipment available at the time meant that we had to get an excavator out there to dig the pits to get the contacts, and then we needed a water truck to fill those pits. In addition to being expensive at the time, we had problems with coupling. And another nagging issue was that we found in some of the areas we had condemned out on the flats, we would get low-level chargeability anomalies that we couldn't explain. The other one that turned out to be our main focus going on is what I call now a deconstructed drill program. A map on the right shows a drill pattern of Cerro Colorado circa 1994. In 1992, it was a bit less drilling on the west side, but essentially we had information from that area. What we did is we went and looked and put the various alteration zones on it. The key one we looked at is what we call the Pyrite Line, which essentially corresponds to the outer part of the pyrite halo. This was where we had strong propylitic alteration, lots of pyrite, and anomalous copper geochem. And I can't remember the value we would have used, 100 ppm or whatever, but anyways, that shows on red. We then did something very scientific. We got 4 pieces of transparent mylar and put on various ones holes at 500 meters, 1,000 meters, 1,500 meters, and 2 kilometers. We then moved that around on our alteration pattern, and what we found was that at 500 meter spacing, you couldn't possibly not hit the Cerro Colorado deposit. At 1 kilometer drill spacing, the worst you would do would hit leach cap, a weak secondary zone, and philically altered rocks below it. At 1.5 kilometer spacing, the worst you would find, no matter how you positioned the holes, was strong propylitic alteration with pyrite. When you jumped to 2 kilometers, there was a risk you could step over the deposit and not see it. However, at Cerro Colorado, it was a paleotopographic low, and there is a skirt of exotic copper mineralization leaking off south of our Pyrite Line, where you get exotic copper mineralized copper oxides at the bedrock gravel interface. So we came down with 2 methods of looking under the ignimbrites, IP and this pattern drilling. The costs were similar. The benefit of pattern drilling was it was a definite yes-no answer. With IP, you could get an anomaly, but you still had to go out and drill it to find out whether it was related to porphyry mineralization. Time-wise, drilling was much faster because we only had to go to an area once. Although we didn't immediately just go with pattern drilling, the early years it was about half the projects were IP, half the projects were pattern drilling. We started having problems with this and recognizing we had problems with this system by early 1994. The high cost of road construction and long lead times to get in to do either drilling or IP meant that we were slowly going broke. We could only test about half the targets we thought we could with the money we had available. This is just north of Cerro Colorado. It's a simulation of one of the targets that we would have had. In the south part of the area, in the basement exposures, we would have had propylitic alteration, color anomalies, copper veining, or breccias. Those would have vectored northwards. The red triangles there would be roughly a 2 by a kilometer and a half grid. But the issue you have is once you get up on the top there, that's all ignimbrites. In order to get to those sites, it wasn't simply just building one road and then a couple crossroads. We ended up having to go to the heads of the quebradas and build 3 or 4 roads to get down to drill it. That wasn't the worst problem. Worst problem was that we were finding that the paleotopographic relief of the basement was significant. On the far left side, you can see that the basement's almost coming to surface. It's within 100 meters. As you step 2 to 3 kilometers to the west, the basement plunges off 300 meters deep. We were finding that when we drilled, for example, 7 holes on one of the property, only 2 of them got to basement by 300 meters. Given that where our mandate was to find an open pitable deposit, it meant much of the area that we had been exploring under the ignimbrites was far too deep. And again, it was time to change our strategy. The strategy change in mid-1994 was to move to Region 2, stay in the Paleocene belt. Again, our competitors were mostly in the Eocene. The ground was available. The Paleocene rocks had potential to host the size of deposit we wanted, so that was good. We would center our search in areas and districts with known porphyry occurrences. We would look within those districts in the unexplored covered areas, and with the concept that if there was a supergene and rich porphyry left to be found in these districts, it would have to be under the pampas, under the cover. Without the ignimbrites there, we were certain that the cover would be shallower, there was easier access. Although this seems like a no-brainer right now, at the time we got a lot of pushback from head office. Kelly wasn't hard to convince that it was the right thing to do, but we'd gotten the money and the mandate from head office to essentially do brownfields exploration around the mine. But eventually Kelly managed to convince both the mine and head office that we should go to Region 2. Between Mike and I, we picked 6 general areas or target areas to start on in June, started acquiring projects or property at the end of July, and we're drilling by the end of the year. When we went out to drill these areas, the mandate was quite clear. It wasn't just to drill any place. If we didn't find alteration immediately surrounding or on one side or the other of the pampa, we moved on. I'll skip through this slide. About the end of '94, Zig Widener joined our group, but just again, the plan was stay close to outcrop. If no peripheral alteration, move on. What did our targets look like? I picked Sierra Gorda because obviously that ended up as the discovery of Spence. Why we would have liked this area, the principal reason would have been the original Sierra Gorda deposit, which at the time was owned by Outokumpu. Known porphyry, too small, too low grade at the time. North of it were a cluster of copper occurrences in the basement lithologies. When we went in there and did the follow-up, we picked 4 smaller areas. We were largely covered areas. The 3 smaller ones would have been the priority targets because, 1, they were smaller areas, less likely to have deeper cover, but also alteration was more pronounced along the edges. On the target that eventually turned out to be Spence, it was focused around a showing called Esqueleto. There was alteration along the flank of it, but at that time the pampa was quite large, and we had a concern based on being burned in Region 1 that the cover might be very deep. By mid-1995, what we were finding that most of our holes were hitting basement by 200 meters, which was good. However, the basement always seemed to be recessive weathering sedimentary rocks or tuffs. By June of '95, we hadn't found any intrusive rocks in the covered areas, no propylitic alteration. We started getting, particularly I was starting to get concerned that maybe these lowland areas were fundamentally less prospective than the uplands. If you do just a simple section based on Cerro Colorado, you can see the mineralization is always centered on an intrusion. always associated with silicification. Intrusion plus silicification means it's a resistive weathering and should form a topographic high. When you couple that with shallow cover, less than 200 meters, and no known block faulting, it means that most of the deposits should form topographic or basement highs. Fortunately for us, by about June or July, we started getting some success. One of our projects called Rick, we hit philically altered granitic rocks, and another Victoria, we got strong propylitic alteration with anomalous copper and pyrite. Our discovery hole finally happened in October of 1995. This is an excerpt out of Kelly O'Connor's memo sent to the board of directors. In it, it describes our Lena property, which eventually got its name changed to Lena. In it, we'd hit a low-grade exotic copper at the bedrock gravel interface, both in the gravels and in the underlying rock at about 0.1% copper. Although this goes on to state that we expect to find a nearby source for it. In Chile, our team was pretty excited by this hole because these sort of grades at that location were very similar to what we saw south of the Pyrite Line at Cerro Colorado in the skirt of exotic mineralization there. And this is a little facetious closing in for the kill. For a number of reasons, it took us a lot longer to zone in on Cerro Colorado than, or the Spence deposit than we had hoped. The initial hole that we drilled with the exotic copper mineralization is the black one and 1. It was one of 4 or 5 holes that we had drilled in the Big Pampa. We were concerned about the depth of gravel, so the initial pass in 95 was very, very widely spaced holes, 3 to 4 kilometers apart. These were drilled primarily to determine what the gravel depths were. Hitting exotic copper mineralization was a bonus. Positive news for us was only one of the holes did not get to basement. Early in February of 96, we came back in and started doing wide-spaced 2-kilometer step-outs around it. Immediately, about 2 kilometers to the west of N1, just where the leach pads there are now, we cut more exotic copper mineralization, and we stepped another 2 kilometers to the north, and we drilled N10. N10 was the first porphyry-style mineralization we hit. We cut through a leach cap, hit a low-grade secondary zone with 0.1 to 0.3% copper, philically altered tonalite porphyry underneath that. We then had a problem because we're getting very close to ground owned by Senor Hector Fuente de la Fuente. So we moved our drills north and started drilling while I tried to negotiate a deal with Senor La Fuente. After about a month of talking to him, it became very clear that he knew exactly what we'd hit in hole 10. And at that point, we decided we'd just pay him what he wanted. We brought our drill back down and started drilling about 1 kilometer at 1 kilometer centers around N2. Hole N19 drilled into the center of the southern part of the Spence deposit. It was a spectacular hole. It had 44 meters of oxide at just about 1.9% copper. Underneath that was another 60 meters of 2.5% copper. And then from there to the bottom of the hole, it averaged 0.8% copper. As soon as we finalized the deal with Hector Fuente de la Fuente, we started doing infill drilling. Miguel Tapia joined us around about hole N19, and later Lucho Moreno came on board. I didn't have a picture of Lucho, so I just stuck a picture in there for him. I apologize, Lucho, if you're out there. So the timeline took about 15 months from the exotic hole till when we have announced our first result. That was 350 million tons at 1% copper based on 24,000 meters of drilling. So why didn't we find more Spences? In my opinion, it was because we began to believe that the reason we found Spence was pattern drilling. As time went on, we started testing more and more risky targets. Initially, as you can remember, but we picked the 6 best targets, all based that they were in known porphyry districts. With time, any old pampa would do. essentially towards the end, we were drilling targets that had zero probability to host a deposit. We completely stopped any innovations or changes of strategy. We just kept drilling. And we justified the failures based on probabilities. This first crept in when we got taken over by Billiton. The logic was, well, if you found one Spence and 22 Papa plays, then by 44 you should have 2. Also, we started thinking that if there were 10, for example, 10 deposits known in the exposed outcrops, then there must be 10 more underneath the cover. This went completely against what we had been concerned about in mid-1995. Essentially, we began to believe that all Papas were created equally. I guess at this point, I'll just go on about what lessons or what things can we take away from it. I guess first is you really need to have clearly define what you need to find and focus on that. If you know what you need to find and describe it in that much detail, it's much easier to pick the areas where you need to go. The second one is an old truism, is that you really need to go where what you need to find actually exists. It takes a lot of risk out of it. But once you get there, there really has to be something left to find, and you have to do something different. My motto has always been, if you do what others have done, you're going to find what they have found. Another point is exploration is a race. Rio Algum found the Spence deposit because it got there first. You could have found Spence using airborne EM. Our competitors at BHP had in early part of 1995 flown a state-of-the-art airborne EM system over central Chile. It identified Spence as a target. Unfortunately for BHP, it also generated so many targets that Spence, I don't think, even made the cut as far as following up. You also could have found Spence using IP. Our competitors at Teck and Caminco had the same idea as us, is to go into these porphyry districts and look at the covered areas. They decided to use IP. I knew the two guys running the exploration there very well. Later they told me that the IP turned out to be extremely expensive, very slow, generated a lot of anomalies that they later drilled and either just found pyrite or couldn't explain. It leads on to this, make sure whatever tools you decide to use work. And what I mean by work is what else will your tools find in addition to a deposit. This was really, I guess, the BHP problem of generating so many targets that you just don't have the money to test them all. Other issues can be if you've got superconductive overburden, it makes little point flying in or doing any sort of EM over it. Another point that was very important to us at Rio Algum was don't overspend. As soon as you suspect what you're looking for isn't there, move on and spend your money on something better. You need what I call a Goldilocks budget. It can't be too small because then you can't test enough targets. Problem with having too big a budget is that whether you give a geologist $1 million, $5 million, or $10 million, at the end of the budget year, there'll be $0 left. All that happens is you give them more and more money is they test riskier and riskier projects. If you restrict the amount of money you give to people, but not so much they can't do their job, it forces the guys that actually know your projects the best to make the hard decisions about which projects they're going to drill. It also means that if they want to drill more than what they can afford, they have to be innovative and figure out a cheaper or better way to do it. The other one is, like any other business in exploration, you have to be continually improving. Exploration's a dynamic industry. It's constantly changing. As you're running your program, you're learning. And if you're not changing and modifying your program as you're learning, you're doomed. Another one to me is, and that's the one that Rio Algum got caught up, is beware of your tools. Every company I know that has had a major success has taken the tool that discovered the deposit and use that for the next 5 years indiscriminately on every project and target they have, regardless of whether that would be a proper method to explore for or not. And the final one is you have to know when to quit. And my favorite quote comes from W.C. Fields, who was a famous American actor, humorist, and philosopher. And his quote was, "If at first you don't succeed, try again, and then give up, because there's no point being a damn fool about it." I'd also like to quickly acknowledge some people that helped us out in the early days of our exploration program in Chile. These include Carmen Paez, Daniel Lopez, and Jaime Diaz. Thank you very much.